So thank you, Patrick, for providing this wonderful public service of creating this GDPNow website. Please explain to us the history behind it. What guided you to reach the conclusion that this was the right way to do this, and so on, as well as what kind of work do you think that we need to do now to, for example, you must be working on cleaning everything up because of COVID and so on. So we'd be very interested in your thoughts about these issues.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Doug, for inviting me, and I think I should be able to pretty much address everything you just mentioned there. So I'll just get started. So GDPNow is a nowcasting model for GDP that forecasts the next estimate of GDP that hasn't been released. So today, the BEA released like the third estimate, I think, of US GDP growth for the first quarter, but it's not trying to track that. Essentially, the first estimate of second quarter growth, it'll be released at the end of next month. And once that's released, it'll transition to forecasting the third quarter. So essentially every 90 days or so, it transitions from one quarter to the other. And essentially at 30 days after the end of the quarter is when kind of the final forecast is made. So the genesis of this was actually a model, a JME paper in 2008 by some Fed economists that ultimately was turned into a model that was pretty similar to the New York Fed's GDP tracking model. They had a model that they updated weekly from 2016 to I think 2021, maybe August 2021, and then they discontinued it because it kind of got messed up by the pandemic, essentially. And GDPNow has had those issues as well. But they had essentially a dynamic factor model where they essentially come up with a summary statistic for how strong the economy is growing. It's essentially one factor and relate that to GDP growth. So there isn't any forecasting of subcomponents of GDP or any accounting relationship. So one example would be if import growth is really strong, that tends to be associated with strong GDP growth in a correlational sense, but in kind of an accounting sense, imports are a subtraction from GDP. So very strong import growth might be a subtraction from GDPNow's forecast of GDP growth, but in addition to what was the New York Fed model. So when I started playing with that in 2011, I had some difficulties getting it to kind of forecast as well as I wanted it to. The Fed actually, since I think 2007 or so, had been submitting quarterly forecasts for a number of macroeconomic variables. Unemployment, inflation, and GDP growth is one of them. So there was kind of a priority to kind of do the best we can in forecasting that GDP growth as well as the unemployment rate and some inflation measures. So I was pretty well versed, or at least reasonably well versed in kind of some of the GDP nowcasting estimates. I guess a lot of my job was kind of preparing material for how well the economy is doing kind of at the moment. And so I was pretty familiar with kind of the source data with what went into estimating GDP in kind of a mechanical sense. And so I sort of married some of this factor model methodology for forecasting data that hasn't been released, and then once the data has been released, use that essentially to forecast GDP growth as best as you can, kind of mimicking to the best degree possible what the statistical agency is actually doing to estimate GDP growth. That's probably more making it sound more simple than it actually is. There's kind of a lot of ingredients that go into estimating GDP, not all of which are accounted for in GDPNow, but sort of a rough approximation that does kind of give the major elements, the major data releases that the BEA is going to ultimately use to forecast or estimate GDP growth. So in the table here below is kind of some other estimates of GDP nowcasts. So some of these are proprietary surveys. A few of these are from the Fed. The bottom one is the St. Louis Fed nowcast. I would say the distinguishing feature among GDPNow relative to the rest of these is essentially it's the only one that's updated at a high frequency and also has subcomponents of GDP. So something like the Philly Fed Survey Professional Forecasters also has subcomponents, but it's only estimated once a quarter, sort of 75 days away from the GDP release. So we won't get a better estimate of that. That was released in May, and that's the last one that's going to be forecast for the second quarter GDP growth. The blue chip economic indicators is released once a month, but that's proprietary, and it only has sort of partial subcomponent detail on GDP nowcasts. So this slide here is essentially, we have a number of slides and tables and spreadsheets that we put up on our website. This is probably the most popular one. So that green line that's essentially drifting down from starting at around 2% in late April and kind of drifting down close to zero currently is the evolution of the GDP now forecast for second quarter growth this quarter as it's accumulated more data. The only thing that's actually also in the chart and the one we put online is the blue chip forecasts. So that middle line in the blue solid line at the top is the consensus forecast from that survey. And the shaded region is kind of the range from the top 10, the average of the top 10 is the top part of the shaded region, and the average of the bottom 10 forecasts out of 50. So it's not something like the 10th to 90th percentile of the forecast range is there. But there are also some other ones that are updated reasonably frequently. And you can see there's a I would say reasonable spread across these forecasts, but probably not all that unusual. It's not unusual to see GDPNow differing from blue chip economic indicators by 2 percentage points or so, especially in the pandemic. That's probably a big error prior to the pandemic, but now that's probably not a surprise. Even after we've kind of gotten through the shutdown and reopening stage, it's still been more dispersion, and the nowcasts haven't been as accurate, and I'll get into that in more detail. In this slide, I put sort of some of the data releases and where there's been big movements in the nowcast. So you can see in where that last vertical bar is where the retail sales release was, and you can see the GDPNow forecast went down there. Moody's has their own high frequency GDP model, forecasting model that's pretty similar to GDPNow, and their model actually went down as well. So and that retail sales release, that retail sales growth was kind of disappointing relative to consensus, and there were downward revisions kind of the past month's data. So kind of in a mechanical sense, this is kind of what you would expect given that release, just as one example. This is one of the slides that we put up on our website, and the URL is up at the top there. So this is decomposing GDP, each day's estimate of GDP growth into the subcomponent contributions. There's 13 subcomponents for GDPNow that it forecasts, but we collapsed some of these into coarser categories. So non-residential fixed investment, for example, is structures, equipment, and intellectual property products. And those have been all combined together in that one bar. So you can see here, where the kind of movement's been. It's a little easier to see in this next slide here. So this is another slide we have on our website, and it's essentially this second slide here is just the bars have been first difference from the previous slide. So if you just take the change in those bars and the change in the line, you plot that here, and you can see pretty clearly kind of which for each day what's been the major driver of the nowcast downward revision, in this case, or upward revision where there have been. So for example here, I think the data point I pointed out here, the biggest decline was on June 2nd, when auto sales data was released. So you can see on that day, the nowcast for non-residential fixed investment, which includes some auto sales, and for consumer spending went down on that day. And so here's the actual data that went into that. These are auto sales, unit auto sales for the US, annualized rates for monthly sales. So prior to the pandemic, we were essentially selling 17 to 18 million new autos and light trucks per year. And you can see that collapsed to essentially half that, I think in April 2020, and then rebounded, reasonably quickly, and actually got past kind of what it was prior to the pandemic, at least briefly. But you can see there's this collapse essentially when essentially the semiconductors supply that ran out more or less, and so automakers can't essentially make as many cars as they would like to sell, more or less. And so this is kind of picking that up in the data. And this last downward movement here is kind of what got fed into GDPNow just recently at the June 2nd release. And you can see the sales rate went down by 2 million units. And that actually, even though relative to the pandemic, it doesn't look that big. If you go kind of in a pre-pandemic scale, there was only 1 month out of the entire Great Recession where there was that big of a decline of sales for monthly auto sales. And
Patrick, I just want to open this up because I want people to discuss what it is we're trying to do and so on, okay? Because a lot of people, for example, coming out of school, if you ask them, if you didn't explain to them what we're trying to do, they would just get into it and start doing econometrics. In other words, they'd say, well, connecting variables and stuff like this. My understanding is that the way that we're thinking about this is that we think about how the data are constructed. We think about the information set, okay, that is used in the final estimates, putting GDP together. We just think, well, that information set will come in gradually over time, and we try to replicate the methodology of what the statisticians are doing, because I've seen people try to do it just with the econometrics, and of course we know the problem with the econometrics in terms of forecasting, but there's also just econometrics in terms of problems in terms of nowcasting. So can you, like, for example, this car sales thing, right? So in the national accounts, they would have expenditures on automobiles, and that would be linked to the quantity of purchases, which is we're looking at. But I just want you to explain to people, like, what is the methodology going into that? Is just people doing econometrics and measuring stuff, or is there some thought going into how the empirical work and the equations are being constructed?
Yeah, maybe I can skip ahead a few slides. I think I have an example of kind of exactly how that's done, and then I can circle back if we need to do that. So this is one example for not for auto sales, but for a non-residential structures investment. So the monthly, so the way almost all of these work is the source data for the GDP subcomponent is monthly. So there's monthly data. So you're essentially going to get up to three data releases per quarter, essentially. And so maybe at the beginning of the quarter, you don't have any of those, or maybe one, but usually you won't have any. And kind of by the end of the quarter, you might have all three or only two of them. So when you have all three, essentially, you don't have to do any econometrics at all. If you have the June data for the indicator, you just essentially take the average of April to June, the average of January to March, compute that growth rate, and see kind of how that quarterly growth rate is related to its related GDP subcomponent back in time. Some of these will be very, very tightly related. So this is one example of this. So the indicator here is value of construction put in place. This is always released at the beginning of the month. Essentially how much builders are essentially spending on building different types of structures. They have both residential structures and non-residential structures, and that's actually about 80. That subcomponent, just sort of building of structures, is about 80% of, not a little more than that, 85% of non-residential structures investment. That also includes oil well drilling, which is not picked up in this construction put in place data. So this indicator is used to forecast sort of 80% of the non-residential structures investment. So the indicator in this chart here, the source data for GDP is that red dashed line. The actual data release itself is in nominal terms. So in order to get what you're interested in forecasting, you're forecasting real GDP, not nominal GDP. So essentially you have to construct a price deflator for the construction spending data, which I've done here in this other slide. So this is essentially, if you wanted to forecast the price deflator instead of the real quantity index, this would be the forecast essentially. So this is built up with a bunch of producer price index measures that are related to construction. So I think I actually have, this is a slide that has kind of what the BEA is using to prepare its estimates. So this is taken, so the BEA on their website, essentially, if you go to the top of the website here, under this resources tab, you'll see something called the NIPA handbook concepts and methods of the national income and products accounts. And so for this thing, it's something like 13 chapters, and each chapter is kind of a big subcomponent of GDP. So there's one for consumer spending, one for inventories. This one is for non-residential fixed investment. And each of these chapters will essentially be about maybe 40 to 70 pages long. And the first half will explain kind of the methodology and kind of words of what they're doing to kind of take this source data and estimate GDP with a verbal description. And then the table actually drills down within each of these subcomponents, what, if you get into a real detailed thing. So I think in this thing, it's, if you want to forecast just office or healthcare buildings, part of non-residential fixed investment, this says use the monthly construction survey. That's the MCS abbreviation. So within that survey, they'll have spending on different types of structures, so industrial structures, et cetera. And they'll tell you the price deflator used for that particular type of structure, essentially. So what GDPNow does in this chart is essentially aggregates all these together. We don't necessarily care about office, healthcare, religious structures separately, but if you aggregate these together and aggregate, add up the nominal amounts and aggregate the price indices in kind of a consistent way, which essentially just uses expenditure weights for each type of structure within the kind of the total. And this does take a fair amount of work, but once you've done it, you can see these lines are pretty close to each other. The one caveat is that you won't actually have, this shows what you have when you have all 3 months worth of data. You actually won't get that third month until after the GDP report. So in the first nowcast of GDP, you actually don't have any of the months of the quarter. And so the model essentially has to forecast all 3 of the months and kind of plug in forecasts instead of actual data for forecasting this subcomponent. And the model does take into account, whether you have all the data released or not into the way it forecasts this. So I'll explain that. Maybe I'll circle back a little, but maybe I should ask if there are any questions on this so far.
So if I can just say, why is this so important? Okay, because instead of just getting a number that said that GDP growth was really weak, okay, for many people, they're trying to make sense out of everything. And it's not just a number for what's going on with GDP, but it's understanding what the underlying trends are and so on. And so even though GDPNow might not be the best forecast of GDP, the fact that we could actually understand what is in it for those people that are trying to make sense of what is going on in the economy, this is the tremendous value added here. So I think you didn't emphasize that quite enough, Pat, that for people that care about what not just GDP is, but what the underlying driving forces in the economy, it's good to know what investment is, because investment is obviously one of the indicators of what is going on in over the next year or so. Any questions, David? We have David Archer on the line, Patrick, who's pushing the idea that we should move FPAS, okay, which is based on where is the economy today, what are the underlying forces, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives. He's trying to push us in terms of thinking more about scenario, okay? In other words, so thinking about risk management strategies and so on. That needs to be obviously connected to the narratives that are driving our interpretation of what's going on today. Okay, so maybe Shelva, Miriam, do you have any questions for Patrick at this point, or
not at this point from me? I want to keep on hearing what he's saying.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Patrick. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, just related to what you were saying about why we're interested in the subcomponents. So as an example might be the first quarter GDP growth in the US was minus 1.6%, I think. But if you looked at employment growth, we're adding something like 400,000 jobs or more per month. So you can see there, and I think the real gross domestic income, which is essentially the same thing as GDP, except measured differently, that grew at something like 1.8%. So there is some kind of fuzziness about how strong economic growth actually is. In terms of actually forecasting future growth, the components that matter the most are the consumption and the just non-residential and residential fixed investment. So I think that's called final sales to private domestic purchasers. So in the first quarter, that number might have been something like actually 2.5 or 3% or something like that. Much stronger than the minus 1.6% GDP top line number showed. Essentially, all of that was net exports subtracted 3 percentage points from growth. So GDPNow is going to tell you essentially if all you're interested in is kind of how strong the economy is, and you're not as interested in kind of the idiosyncrasies that go into the GDP estimation itself. It might make sense to kind of look at these top numbers, the consumption and fixed investment part is kind of the primary indicators of strength. Maybe I can skip some of these. Essentially, we have like a tabular format that we also released on our website with each of the actual economic releases themselves. This first column in blue is essentially the GDP forecast itself. And the columns to the right of that are the subcomponent forecast. So in this red box I put here is that retail sales report where the nowcast went from 0.7 to 0% GDP growth. And you can see here that in the right of that red box, the PCE, which is personal consumption expenditures or consumer spending, that went down a little more than 1 percentage point. And so essentially on this, I think this table, this left column here is essentially the expenditure shares of GDP for each of the subcomponents. So consumer spending is about 70% of GDP. So to get kind of its importance for the contribution to growth, you essentially just multiply this expenditure share times the growth rate. So the change in the growth rate here is essentially a little more than 1%. So just multiply that by 0.7. That's how much the contribution changed. We actually have that, I think, in another table here. These are the contributions to GDP growth. And so you can see that arithmetic essentially went from 2.5 to 1.8. So essentially all the GDP decline that day was just from consumer spending going down, which really wouldn't be too much of a surprise since retail trade, all it kind of factors in is into consumer spending, some retail inventories, and kind of in a very minor way into residential investment. And so these import and export prices, for example, they just feed into net exports and don't have any relationship to any of these other subcomponents. So if you're kind of aware of how the data releases themselves feed into the subcomponents, you can kind of get a sense of why the GDPNow reacted the way that it did after this particular data release. This table here essentially has the subcomponents, and which in the very right column there is which data releases kind of feed into that subcomponent here. So any questions on that?
So for for those of you that aren't used to using this, for me, this is incredible, because if I look at his numbers and I decide that day I want to do a little bit of analysis, I can then go back and adjust his numbers. Okay, like he's given me the expenditure share, so I could go back and say, well, what if this, and if there's only 1 month remaining in the quarter, I can, like, he's provided almost enough analysis that allows me to adjust things. Okay, so again, the transparency involved in producing this stuff, it's an incredible public service, Patrick. It's wonderful. The other great thing is that it's all stored. It really is real time. It's not somebody doing the econometrics and then saying, look, it fits better, when it truly hasn't been tested in real time. So hats off also for the fact that you put this on the website and update it every day. So any good. Okay, carry on. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I glossed over a little bit of sort of how GDPNow works. So the examples I show with that non-residential structure is kind of the best case scenario, where the monthly indicator is extremely tightly related with the quarterly indicator once you have all the monthly data in. But there are some other subcomponents. I think intellectual property products, investment. So that data, a lot of that data is spending on software. And so the BEA actually doesn't get that source data until after the first GDP report, called the Quarterly Services Survey. So they use some other things before that. Some of these they use just extrapolated trends. Some of them they use income from the employment report, essentially how much of the work, how many new workers are there, how much are they getting paid, essentially, and that how much, essentially the compensation of the employees, the change of that is related to what we'd expect for kind of the subcomponent GDP. So some of these might be like programmers or something like that, or IT workers with related intellectual property products, but the relationship is pretty weak, especially when you go back and revise data. When you have that revised data, what the actual revised data is going to be tied to these quarterly or annual releases that we're not going to have, essentially, at this point. So GDPNow actually does kind of two independent forecasts, one with the monthly source data and one with the quarterly subcomponents. So it uses a vector autoregression, which is essentially to say use all of the subcomponents for the past 5 quarters to forecast all of the subcomponents for this quarter that we don't have. And it's a vector, I guess it's the vector autoregression because all of the variables are in the same system. So you use essentially the same variables for each of the subcomponents. All of the subcomponents are used for that, for the past quarter all the way back to 5 quarters, essentially. So that forecast is essentially once you have the last GDP release. So once the second quarter GDP release is released, we'll have the subcomponents for the second quarter, use that to forecast the subcomponents for the third quarter. And that forecast really is not going to change at all, except for data revisions to the second quarter, which are generally pretty minor. So essentially we have 2 forecasts, one of them which is kind of fixed at the beginning of the quarter, and one of them which uses this monthly source data, which we don't have, very much of it at the beginning of the quarter, but we have almost all of it, or even all of it in some sense, in some cases. And then so we take kind of a weighted average of the 2, and the program is actually going to take into account the quarterly model might be better than this monthly model because it essentially isn't depending on data that hasn't been released yet. So the forecast with the monthly data is not going to be as good when you don't have any of that monthly data yet and you're just making forecasts, but it's going to be a better indicator once you have all 3 months of data or even 2 months. And so the weight that's put on that part of the forecast is going to increase over time. And the weights are essentially determined by the regression with kind of past data. Any questions on that? I don't think this is a huge point, but it is kind of a feature of the model. if not, I guess I'll talk in a bit about how this monthly data is forecast. So I guess the easiest way I think to think of it is kind of this with the kind of Chicago Fed National Activity Index. So this is they release this each month. Essentially, they normalize a bunch of 1 month growth rates, essentially, or things like industrial production growth, employment growth for sub industries. I think there's a total of 85 indicators, and they take after normalizing them to have mean 0, standard deviation 1 over the past 50 years. They essentially take the first principal component of that collection of data, and that's just a weighted average of all of the indicators. Essentially, it kind of does the best job of in a regression sets explaining each of the variables separately, essentially. So you take a linear combination of these 85 variables, regress it against each of those 85 variables separately, and the one that kind of does the best job overall on each of those 85 variables together is the first principal component, essentially. So things like employment growth, industrial production growth, those things tend to get like a large amount of weight inside that index. Things like housing starts, existing home sales will get a smaller weight generally. So it's not an equally rated average in some sense. GDPNow does the same exact thing, essentially, takes that Chicago Fed National Activity Index, but then regresses it on past estimates of the factor. And then also, once you get the ISM Manufacturing Index, it does a kind of a rolling estimate of what that factor is going to be for the current quarter, even when you don't have all of the data in. So the Chicago Fed is going to release their estimate kind of in between the 20th and 25th of the month when they have most of the data, but GDPNow is just going to use a subset of that information, kind of do a best guess of what that's going to be at the beginning of the quarter, and then try to estimate with something called a Kalman filter what that actually will be. And then so in the previous slide where I showed this red line, the construction put in place, the data it doesn't actually have, it's going to use this forecasting equation. So the bottom line here is the actual forecasting equation here. So that F is essentially the Chicago Fed National Activity Index, or the model's analog to that, which has standard deviation 1. So essentially when that's 1, 0 would be kind of a typical value. So if that's 1 standard deviation above 0, the forecasted growth rate is going to be a little over 11%. So that'd be a pretty strong forecast. But it also has these lagged growth rate terms for the construction spending. And so the model is going to estimate how many of these Fs and how many of these lag terms are kind of the right amount, essentially, and then use that to forecast the data that hasn't been released. Any questions on that? Okay, just sort of as a brief aside, you can actually use this to forecast GDP growth itself. So the red line here, the blue line is GDP growth itself, quarterly GDP growth. You can see there's this, oh, sorry, I think there's a question. I'm not sure if I got the name.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, thank you, Patrick, for the slide. Just one question for the last slide. So at the end of the day, the estimation or the contribution of the wage of each variable for the forecast will be estimated by the regressions, not by someone deliberating age weight by the 85 variables, right?
Yeah, so yeah, that's correct. So just to be clear, these 85 variables, the GDPNow actually has more of those. I think it's like 126. So in addition to the Chicago Fed National Activity ones, we put in a bunch of source data for GDP as well. I guess the rationale is what you want to forecast is that source data. So you want to kind of capture the movement of that source data in addition to these kind of major macroeconomic indicators. So something like even kind of a trivial thing like mobile home shipments has kind of like a small role in residential investment, that's thrown in there as well. So there's some things that are trying to be picked up adding to that. But you can see it doesn't matter that much. 85 or 126 doesn't really matter. And it is correct that the estimation of the principal component does mechanically give the weights. The things that aren't really closely related to the business cycle get a small weight. You might even get an inverse rate, imports essentially, even though that's a subtraction from growth, that'll get a pot. Stronger import growth will make this thing more positive essentially. Okay. So I guess the one point I guess on this is there are these estimates of GDP growth just from factor models essentially. So the New York Fed was one example of that. So you can see I've shown here the fitted regression line for GDP growth from this factor. And so if you look at kind of this last recession bar, where this is actually the huge decline in GDP growth in the second quarter and then the huge rebound in the third quarter. And you can see if you forecast this with the Chicago Fed National Activity Index using kind of the relationship with the pre-pandemic data, it doesn't drop or recover nearly as much as the actual GDP growth did. And the same thing with the New York Fed forecast. Essentially, it kind of resembles this Chicago Fed National Activity Index, and it didn't kind of capture the strength and the rebound or kind of the initial decline. So there is some value added from actually just kind of doing the mechanical brute force when you have these extremely unusual changes. At least in the second and third quarter of 2020, the GDPNow did a kind of much better job of actually estimating GDP growth once it had all of the data than the kind of factor models did. So this is essentially because this factor, all this is dominated by kind of what happened in the 2020 recession essentially. This kind of just focuses in the last year or so and kind of shows the evolution of the factor over different vintages here. So I think on this, the ones you want to most pay attention to are that the black line here is essentially the May 27th factor when it had data through April essentially, and only estimated the factor through April, and then after that essentially forecasted with these dynamics here what the values for May and June would be. And then once you had the ISM manufacturing release, essentially kind of compute a partial Chicago Fed National Activity Index with kind of just the ISM manufacturing index indicators and a handful more that have been released at that time, and use kind of the Kalman filter and smoother essentially. And that's able to kind of handle having kind of this jagged edge data set where you only have partial data at the beginning of the quarter essentially. And so once you get all of the data, then it's going to kind of resemble the Chicago Fed National Activity Index. But before that, it can change essentially. So you can see the black line went down from 0.07 to minus 0.12. And so on that date, there's actually a decline in the GDPNow forecast from 1.9% to 1.3%, even though there wasn't really any GDP source data, except only partial. Most of that decline was just because of changes in the forecast for the source data because of this downgrade in the factor, essentially. This matters a lot less at the end of the quarter when there really isn't much data left to forecast. So the ISM manufacturing index release on Friday is going to have probably less of an impact than it did 2 months ago. Any questions on that? Just one other point on this. Here I've shown kind of the solid lines, or the ones that aren't dated, are kind of the current vintage estimates, and the lines that are kind of faded are the estimates through February 2020 with March 2020 vintage data. So I'm not showing what's happening in the pandemic here. And so you can see this thing actually got revised up quite a bit, but it's essentially because the standard deviation has to be 1. So when you have this huge increase and huge decrease, essentially you have to shrink everything kind of in the middle of the distribution. So something like a 2 standard deviation decline might be 1.25 or something before that in order to ensure the standard deviation of 1. And so kind of the rule of thumbs that you used before to indicate a recession, it used to be kind of this thing has to go below 1 to be a recession. This is a 2001 recession, was probably the mildest for the US on record. But now essentially you would only need kind of this thing falling to minus 0.75 or something, and that would be consistent with a recession. So kind of these rule of thumb indicators do kind of change because of the pandemic. You had mentioned before kind of how COVID messed up kind of the way this model works. And so here as kind of the forecasting equation for the factor itself. But prior to the pandemic is actually what the coefficients for the evolution of the factor dynamics are, these green coefficients. So if you actually add those up with the 3 lags, the persistence is actually, they sum up to a little over 0.8 prior to the pandemic. And now they sum up to something like 0.2. And there's actually a negative sign here. And that's essentially because, you know, it was never the case before in these recessions. You never had this gigantic decline followed a month later by a gigantic increase, essentially like you did during the pandemic. There hadn't been any on record before. So the models, unfortunately, probably it's going to be averaging kind of these dynamics and with these past historical ones. There are ways that you could probably adjust this by kind of, one would be just to throw out the data, which I've done for parts of the model, not this equation, but other ones essentially. Or you can kind of change the error variance. So that means that would be another way. But there are kind of these non-trivial things about how the pandemic messed up the forecasting from GDPNow. They probably are kind of still kind of messing it up in some sense. Any questions on that? Okay, so this last slide essentially just builds this up here. So essentially now we have the factor through May and we need to forecast it through June. So you plug it into this factor here. You estimate the non-release data for the construction spending put in place. So currently we have data through April. On Friday, data for May will be released, and we won't ever get the data for June until after the first GDP report. So currently, or essentially those green arrows are data that's getting plugged in there for the 2 months we don't have. And then calculating this growth rate of the quarterly data and regressing it against the GDP subcomponent of interest. If this was like a really good indicator, which you know, this is the correlation once you have all the data, which is, you know, very strong. These coefficients, if it was perfect, it was essentially this would be 1, and this would be, the intercept would be 0, and the slope would be 1. Essentially, the growth rate of the indicator, the monthly indicator, would be identical to the quarterly subcomponent. And you can see these are actually pretty close to 0 for the intercept and 1. So the actual growth rate of the monthly data when you aggregate it to quarterly is going to be pretty close to what you actually forecast for the GDP subcomponent. Any questions on that? So I think I mentioned before that the actual spending on buildings like industrial structures, religious structures, healthcare structures, et cetera, is only 80 to 85% of non-residential structures investment. There's also this oil well drilling component. So the GDPNow does the same thing for that subcomponent. It actually doesn't have all of the data that the BEA actually uses. I think one of the series is from the American Petroleum Institute, and that's a quarterly series and it's proprietary data. So the model can't use that, but it does come up with a proxy, this industrial production, oil and gas well drilling, which uses some of the data that the BEA is actually going to use to estimate this in that series itself. And so the red line is essentially what you get if you use industrial production, oil and gas well drilling to forecast the oil drilling subcomponent and non-residential structures investment. So you can see the correlation is not as high as it was before, but it's still much higher. You're still better off using this data than you would be to just kind of make guess based on the past quarter's growth rate for the subcomponent. So there is essentially value added to using this subcomponent as well. And so that in this equation, you don't quite put a weight of 1 on the growth rate for industrial production. You put a weight of 0.8, but it's still highly correlated enough that this IP variable is going to swing the forecast for this subcomponent as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as I correctly understood, if I correctly understood, you're using like factor analysis to forecast GDP or dynamic factor models, or yes, or
we're using dynamic. You can, like, some methods do use that to forecast GDP directly. So the New York Fed model did use that before it was discontinued. Other models do that as well for other countries.
What about PCA, for example, from your point of view, to use, for example, principal component analysis to nowcast GDP?
Yeah, you can do that, I guess. I mean, that would be, I think this is kind of showing this chart here, essentially what, the red and the green line here is essentially what you would get if you used a dynamic factor model to forecast GDP growth directly without worrying about subcomponents. And so you can see it does a reasonable, the red line and the green line are kind of smooth versions of that blue line, which is GDP growth is much more volatile, kind of even outside of recessions. There are going to be ups and downs. Even when the business cycle is kind of strong, you might get these things dipping below 0 when employment gains are pretty strong, and this factor is, suggesting the actual economy is stronger than the published print for growth. But the GDP now is actually kind of forecasting the source data that's going into that blue line and trying to assemble that source data to estimate GDP kind of the way the BEA is going to do it. So I would say the GDP now is sort of like a factor model. Once it doesn't have the data at the beginning of the quarter, when it doesn't have any data, it needs to forecast the data. It's more like a factor model would be. Once all the data is released and there really isn't that much to forecast, the factor model doesn't really matter that much. There's only a couple things, maybe one, some data for the last month of the quarter that won't be released until after the GDP report. The factor model needs to forecast that. But for a lot of these, it doesn't really need to forecast anything, and the factor model doesn't matter.
So can I just say something, okay? Like when I used to manage a group in the research department of the fund, I hired one of the best dynamic factor guys in the world. And we built these things for all countries in the world, okay? And we turned them into pretty charts that we would update every week, okay? And we would report those things. And we never referred to them once in all the years that I was there. Okay, they were only there to make fun of if somebody brought up the whole discussion of this stuff. So what we're talking about here is trying to make sense of things. Okay, so this is kind of like filling out the missing months. Okay, now what does that mean? What does this mean as economists? It means that we think about how the data are constructed. Okay, now let me give you a really good example. I go to Norway, richest country in the world. Okay, it had the highest living standards of the world. The quality of the data from GDP was virtually 0 because it did not enter into the policy discussions. So they first then develop a forecasting and policy analysis system that causes them to think about how GDP is measured in Norway, that it includes oil and so on. So that is what we're focusing on here, Miriam. We're not focusing on forecasting some crazy thing. We're asking the question, what is useful information for having a policy discussion where we have to understand what is in our forecast? Okay, so the dynamic factor models are simply so we thought of replicating, okay, what Patrick is doing here. What's the very first thing we would do? Very first thing we do is we call up the national accountants, and if they have not documented what Patrick showed us, we would sit down with them and learn how the national accounts were put together with the source data, and we would start documenting that. And then from that, we would then build a research agenda to do what Patrick has done here. We would not jump to the econometrics, okay? We would think about how to, because now this, Patrick, I have a question for you here, because in some of the countries that I've gone to, which are poorer countries, because of digitalization, okay, we're already having discussions about developing better measures of economic activity than what the statisticians, the national accountants currently construct, okay? Have you had any of those kinds of discussions? So let's suppose, for example, that you got a new data source, like from the tax authorities so that's the kind of data that I'm talking about, where they can monitor transactions very quickly. Have you thought about or talked to people in other countries about how you would incorporate that sort of information? Because then the discussion with the Statistical Bureau, once they understand what the policymakers care about, that will naturally lead into a discussion about how to improve the data, much along the lines that I was talking about what happened in Norway. Until you had policy interested in something, the statisticians were off measuring things that weren't really relevant for policymakers. But have you thought about any of those things about digitalization and new sources of data that might actually be better than the current sources that the statisticians have?
Yeah, so I think this kind of came up in the very earliest months of the pandemic. So once in March 2020, when kind of the US economy, at least, everything kind of shut down in the middle of the month. So one thing would be like the employment report was actually released. That data kind of covered what happened in the first week of the month or the first 10 days of the month, but the shutdown didn't actually occur until the second part of the month, essentially. So even though that the employment report wasn't great because there were these partial shutdowns, it didn't come, the second part of the month, the economy was essentially shut. So the kind of things that use the employment report are not going to do a good job of kind of what happened in the second part of the month, or these kind of things where you use judgmental trends are not going to do a good job either. So the BA did use kind of these high frequency data sources from kind of credit card spending. And so I still think they actually use some of this for kind of the services spending. And they kind of brought in a bunch of stuff that they hadn't been using before and actually used it for that kind of the third month of the quarter. And the kind of the same thing in the rebound, kind of the things they had been using before just weren't going to kind of do the job of doing this, And so they still release, they kind of update, they have to do all this work where, how do we get the credit card spending data kind of match? There's these differences between credit card spending and actual spending on site. And so we have to and seasonal adjustment and all these things you have to worry about to kind of put them on the same basis. But once you have it, I think I have a slide kind of near the end. So this is one example. The BA series, when they have the monthly data, is this green line here, spending on hotels and motels. Essentially, prior to the pandemic, they wouldn't be using any of this credit card spending data at all, essentially. But once they have it, they do release this thing, and it actually tracks. These are independent sources. I think the red line is actually the BA measured, and the green line is essentially the credit card spending deflated by the CPI. And so the two things do agree with each other, essentially, once you have the actual data released. Once you don't have the data, though, you need the credit card spendings that have come in earlier, essentially. And so to kind of make the best guess for the red line, you couldn't have done that before until you use this credit card spending data. There are other things like that as well, things like mobility and things like that when you're in the pandemic, Google mobility or something like that. But yeah, there are tons of big data. You can do Google internet searches, things like that on, unemployment, things like that. That's where kind of the big data comes in. Same thing with prices.
So if you were sitting down, okay, and this is a question for other people as well, okay, if you're going to do this right, okay, because I see lots of people just do it really sloppily, where they just start doing some econometrics and of course get nonsense and stuff. But if you're going to do this right, and you went to a country, okay, and you sat down with the statisticians to learn about what was in the data and so on, How big of a project would it be? Would it be something that you would say it should take about a month? Should it take 3 months? I'm just kind of wondering, because I've seen years, person years, hundreds of person years wasted because people did not do this systematically like what you're doing. Okay. And of course, there was nothing to build on. Okay. Because it was just a bunch of unstructured stuff. But how long would you think? Like, for example, if you work with Miriam, who's lit up right now, she's from Georgia. Okay. If you worked with her, just roughly to actually do this, are we talking about a year, 6 months, 3 months, but to do it in a structured way, okay, where at the end of it, you could say, this is what we did. And you know, you'd have a research program that people might be able to build on.
I would guess it would take more than a month, certainly. It could take years, depending on kind of how hard it is to kind of assemble the data, the big data. So I would say kind of 3 months might be the best case scenario with kind of the credit spending. They actually did that pretty fast, like the DEA, even if you have 50 economists working on it, you know, you can do it pretty fast. If you only have a couple, that's going to take, you know, 6 months to a year probably.
Okay. So then the answer is that this is something that requires a big investment, but it starts off, what economists do is they map out the framework like Patrick has done for the US, and then that becomes the standard, okay, for how we build this investment over time, as opposed to wasting massive amounts of time estimating silly regressions that don't build upon themselves over time. But anyway, we've got a question from Tamana. Can you go ahead, please? Oh, the mic isn't working.
If you want to type it in, you can. I can read it in the chat.
It's typed, so it's in the chat. The question is in the chat, if you can see.
Yeah, what the data they don't make available at the moment will make these estimates better. Yeah, I think for the services spending, it's probably so some of this credit card data is kind of one thing where you can make gains. Some people actually probably do this. So I see things like people will be using like trips to restaurants. So there's these restaurant sales things where they actually don't have, I think there's a source that actually measures, you know, captures foot traffic essentially for every day of the year, essentially, how many people are going to restaurants, things like that. I think the Department of Transportation releases data on airline travel, things like that. So things like that, you could probably do, even if those things aren't that important most of the time. Kind of after the pandemic, we've kind of seen like you can have these gigantic changes in how much people are traveling or going to restaurants, essentially. And so that probably was kind of small enough to ignore before the pandemic. But you know, I think at the very least you want to be aware of these things, and kind of if this thing kind of go haywire again, how can you get a forecast that's kind of has a chance of being reasonable? Where, you know, GDPNow, it's not kind of these auto regression things aren't going to really do a very good job, or even these factor models aren't going to do a good job on kind of these wonky series like that. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll go from here, but if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. So this is essentially after doing the same thing with oil well drilling and then the kind of value of construction put in place. That's essentially like 98% of non-residential structures investment. There is this like last 2%, which is mining investment, where there is not any source data for that of any value that's going to be released to the public. But since it's only 2% of the subcomponent, it really probably doesn't matter very much. So for that, we just kind of use like a auto regression, which most of the time does a reasonable enough job. There's one example where it doesn't, where I'll show you, but so you just use an AR model to forecast that, and essentially to get the forecast for the subcomponents, just take these expenditure shares and multiply them by their forecast using the source data of GDP that's either released or forecasted, essentially, when you don't have the months. Some of these can change weights kind of quite a bit over time. So oil and gas well drilling, essentially it used to be something like 32% of the structures, essentially, in 2014, when there was all this drilling and fracking activity. But after kind of the collapse in oil prices, after that, exploration has not kind of surged up nearly as much as it did in the mid 2010s. So kind of the impact from this source is half as much as it would have been in the middle of 2014, essentially. So these changes in expenditure shares can matter for some subcomponents. Residential investments, another one where housing starts can, they can go below 1 million a year for the US in a recession, or they can go above 2 million a year in a strong expansion. So these things can swing quite a bit depending where you are in the business cycle. This last equation here is kind of the what GDP now is actually doing. So it's taking this weighted average of, and this notation here, I have DEA is actually what the data is. The T is the sort of the first month of the quarter. So T+2 would be the last month of the quarter. And so essentially that's what the notation I use for that quarterly indicator. The superscript is essentially where it comes from, DVAR or bridge, where the bridge equation's been used. And so these weights, essentially the weight I put on the BVAR, it's just gonna be 1 minus that weight on the bridge equation. So these things are automatically gonna add up to 1. And this weight is time varying, essentially. So that subscript on the expectation operator is essentially, you can think of that H is like how much of the data you've already gotten released to you. So if H is 0, you're at the beginning of the quarter. If H is 2, you're at the end of the quarter. And this is kind of a crude way of doing it, because sometimes you have 2 indicators for the IP. You're going to get all 3 of those data points before the end of the quarter. For the construction put in place, you only get 2 months of 3 months in data. So essentially what GDPNow does is essentially go back in time with each of the same release structure that you have at the time now, essentially. So currently we have 2 months of industrial production data, 1 month of value of construction put in place data, go back in time 1 quarter and have that same data release structure where you don't have to forecast 1 or 2 months of the IP or construction put in place, and do that all the way back till 25 years or whatever. And then use that kind of the bridge equation forecast when you don't have all the data to forecast the actual component you care about. So here is kind of what a snapshot of what it was in the last quarter. So in the very right 2 columns, this is for forecasting first quarter growth. The red numbers are essentially how much weight you're putting on the bridge equations part of the model, or the model where you're actually using GDP source data. So on January 28th, you were essentially having to forecast all of that source data. On April 27th, the day before the first quarter GDP release, you either had to forecast 1 month or 0 months of it, generally speaking. And so you can see these weights on the bridge equations part of the model generally went up over time, some cases a lot. So something like services, exports, and imports, weight went from almost 0 to almost 1, essentially, after you got all the data in. There are some of these where even when you have all the data, it's hard to forecast. So I think imports and exports of goods is kind of the biggest trouble part for GDPNow. So it does put kind of a non-trivial weight on the quarterly data, even when all the monthly data is released, essentially. And so that there can be kind of some inaccuracies in forecasting that subcomponent, essentially. And actually for the first quarter, that's why GDPNow missed. Essentially, if it would have just put all the data on the monthly data, it would have gotten the forecast of goods imports exactly correct. But since the weight wasn't 1, it put 0.48 on this increase 0% essentially. So that was essentially all GDPNow's miss for the first quarter, almost all of it. Any questions on that? Yeah, we don't need to go through all of this. I guess one thing you have to worry about is like some data revisions issues. So the BEA is gonna, for the consumer spending on goods, you get retail sales kind of at the middle of the month. And the BEA is gonna estimate consumer spending on goods at the end of the month. So you'll have that retail spending on goods. You can kind of nail down what the personal consumption expenditures data is gonna be to a pretty high degree of accuracy. But there's also going to be revisions to the retail sales the last 2 months. And sometimes those revisions can be pretty major. So GDPNow actually kind of anticipates what the revisions is going to be to the consumer spending data based on what for the month you actually already have data based on the revisions of the retail sales data. And there are a couple other subcomponents that have kind of the same thing. So inventory investment is one of them. Where these revisions can actually matter. There's only a few, but those are kind of the two biggest ones. There's one subcomponent that doesn't use the factor models at all, is inventory investment. And kind of the reason why is there is source data on estimates of changes of inventories from on book value changes. So these are two series. One of them is what's actually going to feed into GDP is the red series, and the blue line is the book value. These are actually for almost all industries, like manufacturers, merchant wholesales, retailers excluding auto retailers. And so this data is actually going to capture it pretty well. But this is only part of what the BEA is actually going to use to estimate the change in inventory investment. So I guess the way I like to think about it is if you imagine a merchant wholesaler selling oil to a refiner of gasoline, essentially. And so on their books, they have oil priced at whatever, $40 a barrel from a year ago. And they replace that with, they sell it to the refiner and replace it with their oil they're buying at $140 a barrel. Now it's 120. And so the actual stock of their oil doesn't change at all, but they're just replacing $40 barrel oil with $120 barrel oil, essentially. So there'll be this big change in their book value of inventories, but the actual inventory investment is zero, essentially, because the actual barrels of oil hasn't changed at all. So essentially when price changes are going up really rapidly, you have to kind of subtract these inventory valuation adjustments from the actual change in private inventories that's going to be used by the BEA to actually estimate what the inventory investment is going to be. So these green bars are kind of what you have to subtract from this blue line above, essentially. So GDPNow does kind of estimate using kind of the price data. It does kind of form an estimate of what these things should be for the months that have actually been released. So it's kind of not a surprise. It is kind of one of the harder forecasts, subcomponents to forecast, and a volatile one. So unless there's any questions, maybe I'll go through these real quick and then save some time.
So I have a question related to that, which I'm sure the audience will like. Okay. So when we measure GDP, okay, so this is less of a problem in the United States than it is for many countries where there are big terms of trade shocks and so on, right? So this is with regard to the oil, for example, okay? This is the problem that Norway had, but many, many countries face it. So if the price of oil goes up, okay, we use now Fisherian GDP indices. And the purpose of those indices is to phase in permanent changes in relative prices. So if the price of oil goes up, okay, it has you want to have that phased in at some point, and so on. So you have to understand how GDP is constructed if you want to think about nowcasting GDP. I'll give you a really good example. Australia. So for example, when they ship iron ore to China, okay, and they load the ship up, okay, so they load the ship up. By the time it gets to China, the price of the material of the ship could be way higher. Okay, that one effect could affect annualized quarterly GDP growth in Australia by 0.5 percentage point. Okay, just to give you an idea how important these things are, and of course that 0.5 percentage point depends entirely on the methodology that is used for doing chain weighting for GDP. So one needs to know exactly what the input assumption is about what the iron ore that's being put on the ship versus monitoring what the price of that iron ore and how it changes and so on. So my question is it better to understand what is in the GDP, okay, versus just running a bunch of regressions that have that kind of things influencing so that's a question for the audience. In other words, because it's a question that they'll face. For you, Patrick, how is this, like when this price of oil goes up in the national accounts, okay, how is that treated? Okay, like in other words, conceptually. So you're the way that you told the story, the real quantity of oil has not changed, only the price has changed, right? And so, but how is that actually done in the national accounts? Like, yeah,
I mean, it'll feed through imports. A lot of the imports we're going to get are going to be from a lot of the oil we use is imported essentially. So it will actually. So I think it'll generally show up. It won't show up any. All they're going to be counting is kind of the barrels. They'll have a pretty good price. They'll be able to discount kind of in the real imports. It's going to be measuring how many barrels of oil have changed essentially. They have a pretty good estimate of the price essentially. Yeah. So they won't have to worry about oil imports surging because the prices surge.
When the national accountants put together GDP, okay, there'll be like an expenditure add up, okay, like income add up and a production add up, okay. What is, like, for example, and those methodologies don't have to produce the same number, okay. So for some countries, they have a convention of trying to reduce the residual between different methodologies. A lot of that residual gets thrown into inventories and so on. So how did they put the national accounts together? In other words, is it just expenditure? Is it production? Is income? How does that factor into the way that you do these things?
Yeah, so I think they do have a production measure. The second most popular one is the income-based measure. So that's going to be released 1 or 2 months after the GDP release. And there's not really any reconciling between the expenditure side or the income side. I'm actually not sure if they do a value added, actually calculate a number for that. Although one could probably do that, but they do have separate estimates of the income side and expenditure side. They do report like some average of the two and say, you might want to use this essentially, but they don't, if the things disagree considerably, they just report the disagreement essentially and have like a line that's a residual essentially. In the actual measurements of productivity, I think the BLS actually uses the expenditure side measure, but I think John Fernald at the San Francisco Fed takes the average of the two when he's estimating productivity. So there is some disagreement kind of about if you should put some weight on this income side measure. I think the Philly Fed actually has like a statistical measure where they take some statistical average of the two, essentially. They call it GDP plus or something like that. But yeah, those things they can disagree quite a bit. So this slide essentially, so I guess the last slides I'll show kind of estimate how well GDP now is done during the pandemic and relative to before that. So these are the evolution of the nowcasts of each quarter in the pandemic. So each colored solid line is GDP now's evolution. Each dashed line is the evolution of blue chip economic indicators, and the black line is the actual first reported estimate of GDP growth. So you can see that the first 3 quarters of the pandemic look a lot different, especially the second and third quarter, where there's the second quarter, there was just the GDP now essentially didn't know there's going to be these shutdowns essentially. So once they happened, you know, you got these data that were much worse than the model expected. This huge downgrade in the forecast. And the model actually, it didn't know that things were going to reopen really rapidly. So it kind of assumed it was going to remain shut for a while and had priced in these gigantic declines in second quarter growth. Once the economy actually reopened, partly in May and entirely essentially in June, the forecast by the end of the quarter was actually pretty close to what the actual first estimate was. But, you know, 60 days or 90 days before, it was way off. And the same thing happened kind of in the third quarter, even for the professional forecasters, where they had to ratchet up their forecast 20 percentage points, essentially. Things came back much stronger, more quickly than kind of people were expecting. And then these last 6 quarters or so, these have been, you know, unusual relative to prior to the pandemic, but not something like the second and third quarter of 2020. So a kind of a new normal, these last 7 lines are probably a reasonable guide to kind of what, you know, how things are going to, how uncertain we are kind of about near-term forecasts. And these are not as you know, these forecasts are not as accurate as they were prior to the pandemic. So this is essentially decomposing. So these are just forecast errors. So the black line is the forecast error for GDP growth. The bars are the forecast errors for the subcomponent contributions. So for some of these, you can see that the bars, some of them are above 0 and some are below 0, and the GDP growth forecast is close to actually what was released, even though the subcomponents were off by somewhat. So they essentially, the positive error canceled out the negative errors. Once you go, starting the pandemic, the absolute size of these bars is much bigger than they were prior to the pandemic. For the first 3 quarters of the pandemic, especially, even for the quarters where it did pretty good on forecasting GDP growth. So for the second quarter, you know, it missed some of these subcomponents considerably, but sort of the errors kind of cancel each other out, and it was reasonably accurate. So
sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So does this mean, if I correctly conclude, that the net export is one of the most difficult subcomponent to forecast? Like because if this is the error, GDP nowcast, and the contribution of each subcomponent, it seems like that the net export is one of the major contributor of errors, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think part of the reason is that's one where you can have, it's a fairly big, maybe not big relative to the rest of the world, but 10% or 12% of share of GDP. And you can have these pretty dramatic changes. You know, imports can increase 10% in a quarter, not annualized, or they can fall. Apart from the pandemic, you would never see a consumption increase by 10% in one quarter, essentially. It's, you know, because certain things like medical expenditures, things on housing, things like that, just are slow enough evolving that the changes aren't going to be big enough to really move that. So sort of like how hard it is to forecast is kind of a function of how big a share of GDP it is, how volatile the subcomponent is, and how good the monthly data maps into the subcomponents. And for net exports, a big thing is like the price changes. If prices are changing rapidly, it's going to be much harder to forecast in real terms, essentially, which is what you want to forecast.
So can I take a stab at that, Patrick? Because it seems like I'm playing your fiddle. But the wonderful thing is that by providing the chart that you're showing us on the screen, okay, we can look at that red thing, okay, and we could say that there's some volatility in GDP, okay, that's explained by net exports, okay, and I might want to look through that, okay, because you look at those red things, its contribution is quite significant, as Miriam said, okay, but in addition to that, you don't observe 6 of them in a row. In other words, you'll observe a burst of this net export stuff, and it can be a little bit persistent. Okay, so you can see by a couple of quarters in a row, but you don't observe a lot of them, and so another reason for knowing what's in your forecast is if you're looking through a lot of the variation in quarterly GDP, which is quite variable, okay, you're trying to look through that to see what the underlying trends are. So one way is to look at consumption investment, like Patrick is suggesting, and final demand. The other way is to subtract stuff off, like this volatile net export component and so on. Okay, so it's just like the fact that all this stuff is just so transparent and updated. We should just be doing it for as many countries as we can. And Patrick's right, maybe it'll take a big investment, but it's an investment that someday maybe will pay off something versus estimating a bunch of bogus regressions and not keeping track of how unstable those things are. And so on, but assuming that they actually work when they don't actually work. So anyway, I promised not to say that again. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I think so. This chart essentially shows the errors. The red bars are the errors for the final forecast of GDP just by itself. The blue bars are for blue chip indicators. So this is a survey of 40 or 50 economists and just take the average of their GDP growth forecasts and use that. And so you can see some of these bars are actually, they're all bigger essentially after the recession, after the pandemic. The blue chip, I think I'd put the average absolute error there. And they've both gone up quite a bit, GDPNow and blue chip essentially. Maybe they're a little smaller kind of at the end of the series, but they're not as small as they were in the 3 years prior to the pandemic, either blue chip or GDPNow. And these are, I guess I would emphasize like the GDPNow and blue chip, you can see some of these errors are kind of not in the same direction. So on average, they might have a similar performance, but in a particular quarter, one might do better than the other. And you wouldn't necessarily expect them to converge to each other once you have all the data. And it's not clear, you know, each of these panelists is doing the same thing that GDPNow is. But, you know, what I found in the past is kind of, if you look at any individual forecaster, GDPNow does pretty well, just kind of average relative to the typical forecaster. Once you average all of them together, it has a hard time doing as well as that average, essentially. These are the average errors for the subcomponents. And so I think the faded lines are pre-pandemic. They're the average, either the growth rate itself or the contribution to growth. So the blue line is from the survey of professional the blue is the survey of professional forecasters. The red is GDPNow. The faded ones are pre-pandemic average errors and the absolute errors, and the post-pandemic is essentially the solid or the more striking colors, essentially. And so for almost every subcomponent, these are 75 days ahead. That's the only one the survey professional forecasters is going to release. And you can see almost every subcomponent, it's higher than it was prior to the pandemic. The one weird one is kind of the state and local government spending. The GDPNow did much worse essentially after the pandemic than before. And the survey professional forecasters didn't do much worse. And so there's just one kind of crazy series, state and local government sales to other sectors. So this is essentially whenever the state and local governments essentially give tuition subsidies to attend college or pay part of Medicare expenses or things like that. And so these first 2 quarters, essentially, that mini drop in the first quarter of 2020 is partial. I guess the closing that happened in March, and then there's this gigantic drop in the second quarter, and then this gigantic recovery, essentially. So for this subcomponent, GDPNow hadn't been using any monthly data at all, essentially. And so those blue dashed lines are what the model actually forecasted was going to happen rather than what did happen. And so you can see it forecasted these big declines after it never really actually materialized. And that's a big reason why it did so much worse on this thing in the kind of the early quarters of the pandemic. It's kind of gotten back to normal. So even though I did change the methodology, the red is what it would be kind of if you had been using the current forecast methodology. It doesn't really matter as much now once the kind of the worst parts of the pandemic are more than 5 quarters in the past. On this slide this is just a methodology summary for PCE and services. So this is kind of a cautionary tale of how so the CES is concurrent employment statistics. This is for estimating spending on essentially medical services, what the BEA actually does. So what I put in red here is this. For the first estimate, the BEA is essentially using current employment data. So essentially wage and salary earnings for medical workers, essentially. That's what they're going to use for the first estimate. For the second and third estimate, they're going to use this quarterly services survey, which is not released until the first GDP estimate is released. But once they have it, that's what they're going to use essentially. And then the one in green is the service annual survey, essentially. So the hard part about this is essentially this vintage problem where maybe the current employment statistics data for medical services spending did a good job of forecasting in real time what happened in 2015. But once you have this kind of revised time series data where 2015 data is based on the service annual survey rather than the employment statistics survey, the sort of the bridge equation is not going to capture that as well if you are actually using first vintage estimates all the time to do that. So that would be a big job definitely to kind of program all these real-time, use real-time estimates to estimate all of these things. Essentially only use kind of the first estimates of GDP to estimate these bridge equations, but that is kind of one thing that kind of messed up the model somewhat. On consumption, so I think the big thing that changed sort of during the pandemic is consumer spending got a lot harder to forecast. And so in this chart here, I'm just showing the survey professional forecasters average errors for the first GDP estimate 75 days ahead. So that red line is essentially what happened prior to the great moderation, essentially when volatility of data went down. And so you can see the average errors used to be 2 percentage points plus for the first GDP growth estimates. When the great moderation happened, it went down to essentially a little more than 1 percentage point. And now it's kind of, even if you throw out those 3 crazy quarters, kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, it's still a lot higher. These SPF forecasts still have higher forecast errors than they did prior to the pandemic, even though there hasn't been a recession in the last 5 quarters. And so partly this is related to, I think, consumer spending growth volatility. So these are just monthly growth rates of consumer spending. and you can see some of these growth rates where there was these big stimulus packages. Essentially, you were getting growth rates that are much higher than anything you'd seen before. So you can see this is actually a decomposition of disposable personal income. Essentially, you had a 25% increase in like 1 month when you had these big stimulus packages. And even if consumer spending didn't react as much, its reactions are still much larger than anything you've seen before, essentially. That may have worked itself out partly if, you know, there isn't more stimulus packages. But I still think there's this volatility in kind of a lot of these services categories and even goods categories where kind of the supply chain issues haven't been worked out that are going to make things harder to forecast. I guess the last point, this will be the last couple slides. In terms of like, if you wanted to do a weighted average of GDPNow and the blue chip forecasters, this is kind of what the weights you would assign on GDPNow. So the blue is essentially what you would do if you include the pandemic era data, excluding the first 3 quarters of the pandemic. The red is kind of the 5.5 years before the pandemic. So the weight you would put on GDPNow, the left chart is for GDP, the GDP growth. The second chart is for consumer spending growth. And so essentially this reflects that essentially you should put, you put a higher weight. The model wants to, or the statistical average does better when it puts a higher weight on the blue chip forecast, including the pandemic data, than if you didn't include the pandemic data. And for consumer spending, the difference is much larger, especially. So that's a big thing that's kind of suffered. For things like net exports and inventories, those haven't changed as much. And even though there's a hard for forecast, everybody has a hard time forecasting those things. So GDPNow does reasonably well on that still relative to others. Those weights are kind of close to 1 once you have all the data in.
So I had 2 comments, Patrick, okay? One is, it must be possible to set the model up, okay, where you could not only ask what weight to put in blue chip or something else that you have a track record on, but you could also set up the model so that you could say, how would I adjust the components of GDPNow to be consistent with the revised, with placing a weight on this? And if you could do that, okay, which is what I'm working on, then obviously you still have the story, okay, but you might have some additional predictive content from some other favorite forecast. So have you thought about setting up the model so that you can place a weight on other forecasts, but yet calculate consistent decomposition?
I haven't done that per se. No, I do have runs of the model where essentially there's this issue where you use the monthly data only or the quarterly data. And so I have used that where you just use the monthly data and the forecast essentially. And so I would say the performance of that is pretty much the same. So if all you wanted to use is source data to forecast GDP, it would do about as well as if you kind of use the past subcomponents. In terms of weighted averages of, I haven't done that in real time, but I have done some things where like the blue chip forecasts, they only forecast some of the subcomponents of growth, but not all of them. So, I mean, essentially, you can kind of back out what their forecast for the part of GDP growth that hasn't been released yet, or that they don't forecast. You know the top line forecast and some of the subcomponent forecasts, you can kind of get what the other ones have to be. And then, so if you can average those essentially with GDPNow in some sense to kind of get subcomponents that are going to be consistent. I think if you use the weights, the same weights for all the subcomponents, it's probably going to be add up in kind of consistent way. But if you use different weights for different subcomponents, they'd be harder problem probably.
I loved your comment about when you were talking about try to make it real time and so on. So I love the fact that you struggle with that. Now, obviously, it can't really be real time until we start doing it in real time. Okay, which I think is, which kind of then raises the question: at what point do you stop? Like for GDPNow, at what point did you say we're going live? In other words, because so can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, how did you decide to go live? Because obviously you will always just be kind of second guessing and stuff unless we go live, right? Because we always go back and maybe improve something and spend a lot more time thinking about the real time aspects of the inputs and so on. So how did you decide to go live? Like, could you tell us a little bit about who encouraged you, or was it your initiative, or?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think sort of by September 2011, we had kind of alpha version of GDPNow. And so over the next year, you kind of noticed things that went wrong. You kind of fixed some things. So one example would be you would use housing starts and existing home sales just to forecast residential investment directly. But after a while, we essentially used the housing starts part just to forecast permanent site residential investment, the existing home sales to forecast brokerage commissions and things like that. You get more granular on the subcomponents and things like that. Kind of fix some things with the model. So kind of by like the middle of 2012 was pretty similar. And on our website, we actually do have kind of the real-time data from 2011 to prior to the second quarter of 2014. I didn't show it in this chart, but the bars looked, I would say they were a little worse than this, but not much worse. And so we essentially had, close to 3 years worth of data where, we're not quite as good as the professional forecasters, but, good enough that we have a reasonable confidence that, in kind of the macroeconomic environment you're in, if things don't change, the forecasts are probably, you have a pretty good idea what kind of the performance is going to be. Obviously, if you're going to something like a pandemic, things are going to change pretty rapidly. I mean, that's the thing you always have to worry about, is kind of, if you're not haven't experienced a recession or something, when you're kind of trying to fit the model, you really don't have a good idea how it's going to do when you kind of confront the model with a situation it hasn't experienced in real time. So there is just kind of some element of wishful thinking when you kind of release these things, I think.
Brave. You need courage, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing I would also emphasize is this is just like a model forecast. So I guess sometimes when things say like Fed predicting recession or something like that, we want to emphasize that this is kind of like a model that's subject to error, and not necessarily what people on the FOMC committee would forecast necessarily, or things like that, or even a good summary of what the best forecast would be. So, I mean, it's hard to kind of put that caveat in the releases and have it kind of filter through, I think, but it is something you should, at least we try to emphasize that point as well. I did have some things, I mean, in terms of what people are actually doing. So in terms of forecasting global GDP or GDP growth or other countries. So this is some survey work from the ECB on like what our forecasters actually do when they're forecasting Euro area GDP growth and other things. And so I think for those countries, it's probably pretty similar to what the US is essentially. So when they're doing short-term forecasts here, that second bar says the yellow and orange bars say they're using single equation models or vector autoregressions. Things are probably pretty similar to GDPNow, even if they're not quite as complicated. They're kind of somewhat related. They're not using really factor models. That's that green bar. So those things are probably, in terms of what people are actually using, you had said before that you just put these things out to make fun of them, essentially. Even if they're not making fun of them, they're at least not using them. Kind of like it's kind of the pivotal things in their forecasts. And this is actually saying, this next chart is saying how much judgment versus actual estimation with models do you do? And that orange bar there is how much judgment they're using for their short-term GDP forecasts. just maybe 15 out of 80% or out of 100%. But for their longer term forecast, they're using, over half of their forecast, at least when they reflect on self-reflect, what they think over half of it is essentially judgment based. So in terms of how you actually need to, what would make forecasts, what you would use for kind of a short-term and longer-term forecast is probably going to be very different. And GDPNow is probably not going to work as well for, forecasting 1 to 2 years ahead, essentially. Those things are kind of where you probably want to use like a few indicators like industrial production, employment, things like that. And that's probably going to, rather than get real granular, essentially. I think that unless there's any.
Okay, good. So, I'd like to thank Patrick. We're organizing a special session at the Central Bank Macro Modeling Workshop in Columbia in November. That's going to be dedicated to this GDPNow for groups working in central banks and other institutions that are trying to employ this type of methodology. And so I would just like to thank Patrick. And also he must have a lot of support at the Atlanta Fed, putting all this wonderful stuff out there, okay, that allows us to look at it, think about the methodology, and assess the numbers as they update them, and so on. So thank you, Patrick, and hopefully we'll see you at the Central Bank Macro Modeling Workshop, where we'll talk about possible applications to other countries. Let's cross our fingers and hope some people take up the challenge. Okay.